welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and I am joined by the author of a really beautiful book. I read it a few weekends ago, and it was a really lovely, sad, melancholy, but beautiful, bittersweet, all sorts of very complex, nuanced emotions. A really nice way to sort of spend a weekend, and I am so excited to talk about this book. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
For sure, Jen. My name is C.H. Hooks, and my book is Can't Shake the Dust. It's about 3 generations of the Lemon family who are dirt track racers in South Georgia. And uh, I know on the surface that sounds, really like an action book or something like that, but it's more about the intricacies of family and how these relationships can be strained intergenerationally. The mother is also one of the viewpoints in there, Nanny. So it's written from 3 different first-person viewpoints to try and dive into, I guess, a close examination of how this family is dealing with, I guess, the intergenerational trauma of being kind of messed up, which I think on some level, hopefully, just about everybody can identify with. I don't think there's necessarily anything, such a thing as perfection in family. But yeah, I hope that is at least a brief overview of it. If you have anywhere you want me to dive in further on that, I'm happy to do it.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I really am interested in the family dynamics and how complicated they are and how families can repeat themselves over generations. I think that is something that everybody can probably identify in their own families as well. Before we hop into the book too much, I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about your journey to the book, your writing career, and what led you to this project. I'm really curious in particular about how you think teaching may have inflected your process.
Okay.
Has it changed how you approach writing or your craft or anything like that?
That's a good question. I think teaching has more than likely influenced my writing in that I just talk about it more. I am, I guess, notoriously introverted. And so I've had to get used to being able to talk about my own writing. I mean, writing is it's an isolationist thing. I mean, we kind of disappear into our own head and sit there with a computer or a page for God, I don't know how many hours, just hours and hours and hours. It's 3 or 4 hours a day if we're lucky, if we have that kind of time on our hands. But I think that teaching has forced me to come out of that space and forced me to actually share it, to be able to talk about it and to be able to explain and maybe parse out my own process and get to know it a little bit better. So I think that's a positive thing. I don't think it's changed the way that I write, but it has changed. Um, it's almost like if you're in a business environment, you have these standard operating procedures or something. And so I think for my writing, it's forced me to analyze what procedures I go through that are successful and which ones aren't in trying to put together a manuscript. I'm teaching a novel writing class right now at Flagler College, and that class has absolutely forced me to break down almost everything I do because there's so many different ways to write a book. I mean, aside from the fact that you have to sit down and do it, there are a lot of different ways to put together a manuscript. And so when I was working on my last book, Alligator Zoo Park Magic, I was able to figure out a process that worked for me as far as even just organizationally, because previously my only organization had been in pocket notebooks where I just, jotted down notes and then transcribe that into a computer, which is great. I mean, there's a place for that, and I still use that. I still have a notebook with me all the time. But notebooks fall out of back pockets when you're riding a bicycle sometimes, and and sometimes more than once. And so I've become much more deliberate, I think, and I became more deliberate with Alligator Zoo Park Magic when I was drafting that out of necessity. Because if I was going to do this for the long term, it comes to a point where every writer, I think, has to figure out their own process and how they're going to make something that is scalable to be able to continue to do this thing. Because otherwise, what an exercise in frustration, right? What the hell would we be doing? We'd just be kind of writing ourselves bumping into walls and not really ever being able to own our own craft.
That is so interesting. And your answer gets at like a really interesting contradiction that kind of sits at the heart of like writing in our modern world is that for a lot of the time you have to be really comfortable being alone with your own thoughts, with the page, sort of eschewing contact with the outside world while you're working on your thing. And then
Oh
when that's
yeah.
over, you have to get really public facing and do the podcasts or like, the interview circuit and all these other like promotional activities. And that's hard to encompass both those things, I imagine.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, I was the podcasts are fun because this is a way to interact with another human one-on-one. And I mean, obviously not, we're not sitting in the same room, but being able to have a discussion with real questions and all that. It's the dog and pony show of when you start trying to organize events and things like that, or start doing self-promotion. I was emailing with another writer this morning because he was saying that, he had and he's had a long and successful career, but he had done a couple recently where like one person showed up or something like that. And that happens. You have those events. And I said, well, sometimes we just got to put on our clown makeup and and hit the trapeze again. And it's part of it. It's Barry Hannah said too that there's this gamble, right? What other career can you do where you're going to gamble spending hours and hours and hours of your time producing something that may or may not ever see the light of day? And so when you sign up to do it, it's it's a gamble, and you're either going to win some and lose some, or you could potentially get shut out for your entire life. But it has to be something that is within you that you feel okay burning that kind of time.
Mhm. Absolutely. That's a real leap of faith that you have to
Oh
take.
yeah, definitely.
So turning to Can't Shake the Dust, I'm really curious about what the inception point for the project was. Was it a particular character you wanted to explore, or the world of dirt racing, or a mood? Where did it evolve from?
I love that you brought up inception point because this is such a theory that I consider a lot. When I'm reading a book, I'm like, I feel like this is the moment where that person came up with this book idea, and they have written everything around this. And so I think for Can't Shake the Dust, I did go to some dirt track racing when I was young, when I was a kid, and it was fascinating just watching people, a car gets in a wreck on the track, or even a demolition derby, and they take a sledgehammer and pound out the side of the car and put it back on the track, and they just keep going. There's a metaphor for resilience in that. And so I think that memory, or those core memories, along with the fact that I grew up in South Georgia and I went to Catholic school, and in some cases I was probably the rare Protestant kid there. And that's an interesting dichotomy too. I mean, that existence and in that space. And so yeah, and there is or was a real bar growing up called the Monkey Palace, where they had live apes in cages, or not in cages, but behind plexiglass. And so all these things started coming back to me. Alligator Zoo Park Magic was definitely a North Florida book. I was living in coastal Georgia, teaching up there when I wrote Can't Shake the Dust. And so being, I hadn't lived in South Georgia, not in that kind of capacity, since I was 15 years old. And so being back in that space just, I think, spurred a lot of memories for me, and a lot of frustrations in some ways. and it jogged some stuff, I think. And the area of coastal Georgia where I was living, Brunswick, Georgia specifically, is not a wealthy area. It is, I believe, or at the time, it was the poorest county, or not county, but town in Georgia, but per capita. So poorest town in the wealthiest county. So isn't that interesting, right? You even then you have these little areas that are divided by water where you'll have, very, very wealthy people. I mean, true have and have nots. And then downtown there, just some of the most in your face poverty that you can see in the US, tarps covering houses as roofs and stuff. And there's also a level of hope in that, right? That the kids that are growing up in an area like that will somehow be able to pull themselves out of it. But realistically, there are going to be a lot that don't. And so all of that combined with my own kind of growing up in South Georgia for 14, 15 years of my life really kind of pushed me into that space of recalling these things. And then, the imagination kicks in and all of a sudden you've got a story that you're just trying to harness because it starts to run away. And you get in your own kind of, if you want to talk craft, your own kind of race against the clock to be able to get characters on the page and to capture emotion and voice before it's too late.
Mm.
Because in my experience, I have to craft a manuscript or at least a first draft of it very quickly. In order to be able to be consistent when I go into the revision phase with what characters sound like and what spaces look like in my head.
Nice. I knew that monkey bar had to be real. I was like, this is too
Oh yeah.
this is too
Oh
weird
yeah.
to be made up.
I forget what year it shut down. I think it was the early 90s where they finally shut it down, but it was there for like 20 something years, I think.
My God.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. And I'm really actually glad that you brought up the, let's say, like the sort of the landscape of where this is all set in terms of not only like the sort of extreme poverty in which all of our characters are living, but also the extreme sort of marginalization in living in these like very high, let's say like high inequality areas where you could be next door to people who are much, much more well off than you.
Oh yeah.
Um, could you talk a little bit about crafting sort of the dynamic of our three POV characters? So we have Little Bill, Wild, and the mother. Could you talk about what you did sort of to capture their voices and their different perspectives? Because they all are living in some ways the same story, but they have radically different experiences and perceptions of that. So could you talk about navigating that?
What a pain in the ass. Can I say that on here?
Yeah. Yes.
I wrote the book initially. I can't remember if I wrote it from Wild's perspective in first person or Little's perspective in first person first. And then I went back and rewrote the book in third person. And then I went back and rewrote it again from either Little or Wild. And then finally, after writing the book, I guess 3 times at this point, a first reader, second reader, really at that point, gave me the feedback that because I kept fleshing out the character of Nanny, the mother. She really was very present in her story. It needed to be told. It needed to show up in the same way that both of their, Little and Wild stories were showing up. And so at that point, I realized how much hurt and dejection and frustration was being squarely shouldered by the mother's character. And it had to happen. I had to write a first person account of that as well. And so at that point, that's where the 3 first person accounts start to weave together to build the story. And it took a long time. So the first draft of the story, I cranked it out in probably 6 weeks, maybe less. That's generally how I try and do that of a first draft. And so I wrote that around the time that Alligator Zoo Park Magic was coming out. I'd had the idea for it a little bit earlier than that, but crafted that first draft of it then. And so it is now coming out in 2024, so 5 years later. And so going through the process of writing writing the story in those really four different ways. Third person didn't work at all. It was way too distant. And I wouldn't really argue that I do third person well anyway. I like to be in the head of the character that I'm writing. It's an argument for multiple personalities, but at the same time, it had to happen that way. I had to get that close to the characters, and it was really wild. Once I wrote Nanny's perspective, the mother's perspective, it's like all the puzzle pieces were there at that point. The story started to fill itself in. The level of kind of mysticism and the desperation that she has for creating some sort of change when she doesn't know how to in any other way. And it really, I feel like at that point everything kind of locked together.
Mm. Yeah, I think like that close the first person for all three characters makes a ton of sense. Also in terms of like the themes of the novel and what you're trying to do, because they're all, in this world that feels very small to them and perhaps like claustrophobic at times,
Yeah,
and like sometimes the third person can suggest a sort of distance that actually like makes the world bigger in a way, if that makes sense. I'm not sure, but
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And certainly as a kid, I remember feeling claustrophobic. So, this kind of desperation to see what else is out there, to see some other part of the world, to see something that feels, like you said, bigger.
Mhm.
Yeah,
I would love if we could talk a little bit about Little Bill, because I think he is my favorite point of view character.
yeah.
Certainly, like children have the least opportunities to sort of like disappoint you or make you angry, so maybe that's why. Um,
Yeah,
but I'd love if we could talk a little bit about him and sort of, he's living in the shadow of his father in so many ways while also like carrying him
right,
ways that are very interesting. And that is such an interesting thing to put at the heart of his character because he's so young, but he has to be a lot older than he is.
right.
And so
Yeah,
could we talk about like maybe like what it's like to sort of reach back and try to capture that childlike perspective, because like when we're reading children, like we as adults, we know a lot more about like where things are probably going to go for them and what the
right.
things that they're experiencing are going to mean to them. So
Yeah.
can you talk about sort of capturing that, like, yeah, that naivete, but also that sort of like, I'm older than I should be?
Yeah, yeah. I think that kind of the forced maturation of a kid ahead of the time when they really should have to, experience the things that they're experiencing. I think that forces this unnatural confrontation between, like you said, naivete and also reality that they're not even able to fully grasp yet. And so that was certainly the challenge, is writing a character that almost is like begging to live in some form of innocence, really just wants some level of comfort in a situation that is really uncomfortable. And the realizations that come too, because being 13, 14, 15 years old, you're at that point where, what's the quote, that you're adolescent until until you can forgive your family, and then you become an adult. You're a kid until you become an adolescent because you realize that your parents aren't perfect. And it's a cliche, but at the same time, there is a level of truth to that. There's a reason cliches exist. And I think that Little is struggling with the fact that every day he's being subjected to a situation where he's having to grow up faster than he's necessarily ready to do. Every day he's seeing his dad or his grandfather do something that he's being put in situations that are very adult, and he's only grasping the pieces of that, the fragments of these adult situations that he can, because his brain, I mean, is psychologically is just not there yet.
Mm.
Physiologically, it hasn't grown to a point yet where it can truly grasp what's happening around him.
Mm. Yeah, it's very immersive in that, yeah, I feel like you are experiencing a lot of the story with him in his chapters.
Yeah.
And he's fascinating, I think, to juxtapose with Wild because you sort of get to see him be a father to Little, but then also a son in the shadow of his own father. And he's such a great agent of chaos, so he generates a lot of story
Oh
and
yeah.
problems, you know. But it's really interesting to get to see him through like both of those lenses, like sort of in quick succession sometimes, you know?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, and Wilde expects a friend. I
Mm.
mean, there's this, he puts off on him that he's supposed to be this obedient son or respectful somehow, but Wilde is looking for someone to be right there with him as he falls apart.
Mm. Yeah. And that's a lot of responsibility for for
Yeah. Oh
Little
yeah.
while
Yeah.
also risking his life, you know, on the
Oh yeah. Yeah.
wow. So yeah, this is so lovely. And I think it also really vividly evokes the dirt racing world, which is sort of what my last question is about. You said you experienced it a little bit. I'm wondering how much additional research you may have done because like even the descriptions of like the controls and like the feel of the driving and how it feels to sort of be in control or not in control of such a powerful machine. So can you talk about where that came from too?
Late nights on dark streets. I don't know. Last book tour. No. Yeah, I mean, I, I did do, or I did go and experience, of course, dirt track racing when I was younger, and then also quite a bit when I was about Little's age, because we'd have a demolition derby that would come through, which is obviously different than dirt track racing. But and then yeah, there is a fair amount of research that goes into it because the last thing you want to do is write a book and like get some little thing wrong and someone just totally fixates on that and then and then it ruins the experience for them. So yeah, I did actually spend quite a bit of time on research as well. And then we have it's funny, it also inspires me to want to see it more, which is an odd thing, especially after living it in my head. But we have a track like 30 minutes from here, and another author friend of mine from down south and I were going to meet there coming up pretty soon just to like kind of celebrate the book coming out and drink some beers and watch some racing. So, it's it almost writing a book like this, it almost forces things to kind of become a part of your life in a way that maybe you don't anticipate, maybe that you can't plan for.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense, you know, because it is like obviously it's presented as wildly dangerous.
Oh yeah.
You have to like convincingly express the appeal of it, you know, because like you have to show why these characters are so passionate about it.
Yeah.
And I think it almost functions in the end the way that like, you know, how like Jurassic Park didn't actually convince anybody that dinosaur parks would be bad. You know, we all
Right.
still want to go to a dinosaur park. Like, I still want to go to a dirt racing, you know? So,
You don't want to just go and be a spectator. You want to go and do it.
yeah, absolutely. I'm like, I'm sold. This is yeah, answer to all my questions, my problems.
Bring your sledgehammer. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for coming to talk about this book. It's so lovely, and I'm so excited to share it with our patrons. What is on your horizon? What's next for you?
I I'm about to go on book tour, which is, I mean, shocking. You wait, 2.5 years for a book to come out, and then all of a sudden it's here, less than 2 weeks away. And so I'll be headed out for a good little bit. And then I just finished up another manuscript. Well, finished up. I'd say second, third draft territory, but I feel good about that. And then the writing never stops. This is, a part of life. It's what we do, and it, we can never escape it.
Well, best of luck. Congrats on this one. I am, again, so excited to share it. Yeah. So, patrons, it's on you. Please go check out Can't Shake the Dust. All right. Go to your favorite independent bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for those things. Thank you again for joining us. This has
Oh,
been
Jen, thank you so much. No, this has been my pleasure. It's been great talking with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. It is now time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.